It's a combination of a lot of our past practices. We haven't done a lot of prescribed burning. We've been putting fires out for almost a century. We've allowed fuels to build up in the forest, vegetation succession. And then on top of that, we have climate change, which has made fire seasons longer. It's dried things out. It's caused drought, which has increased mortality. So the mega fires are a combination of past practices and climate change. Well, adaptation itself is going to have to be flexible and adaptable because we don't even know exactly what that's going to be. It's going to continue to change. So the yard posts that we see today for climate change for maybe 10 years from now, it may be completely different. So adaptability is key. What we understand about climate change when it comes to things like megafires is that we need to mitigate that. We need to try to limit megafires, and that will enable us to, in some ways, adapt to climate change. Climate change is going to deliver us bigger fires, longer fire seasons, more smoke, more cost, more cultural and economic environmental impacts, and we have to change the way we manage the land, accepting some of what climate change is going to give us and then try to mitigate it a bit. No, we're not. I think we're slow to gain a public acceptance and a government acceptance of what climate change is going to deliver to us. I mean, we're still having arguments in some jurisdictions about if climate change is even happening. I think for the majority of people, there's an overwhelming acceptance that climate change is our future. The resilience part, we've been even slower on that, which is tragic because we have a very limited window to get things turned around. It's going to mean that we do things very differently. A lot of our traditional practices, things that we hold dear, we're going to have to be flexible and change. There's going to be winners and losers in this, and as humans, we are a very adaptable species, and we're going to really be testing that this time. It was very variable, and we have to understand that throughout a lot of North America, that fire was delivered by First Nations. It was survival. They had a very sophisticated understanding of fire effects. They knew when to burn and how often to burn, and for specific plants. Fire enabled them to survive. Trees were the enemy. If you're a First Nations person living on this landscape, you followed fire and reaped the benefits. The berries, the nuts, the roots, the tubers, the wildlife that survived on it. And you collected enough to survive the winter. If you were in this landscape and you ran out of food in December, what were you going to eat? So fire was their best tool for creating the landscape that they needed to survive on. And they had a huge footprint on this landscape. I believe that indigenous fire was even more overwhelming influence than lightning in North America. And that's natural. I mean, when we talk about natural fire, we're talking about human fire. And we had large populations of First Nations, indigenous people in North America. So that natural landscape, in a lot of places, it didn't have a lot of trees. And it was very open, and what trees were there were very fire tolerant. They were large diameter, they were tall, they had thick bark, gaps in places, clumps of trees, lots more hardwood, shrub, herb ecosystems. Not at all like what we have today. These are very unnatural landscapes. They are almost 180 degrees from what they were. But that was survival. You know, it's tragic that you know, a lot of the elders in these communities who had that knowledge are dying off rapidly. I spent 3 years in Arizona working with the San Carlos Apache tribe, and we had a staff ethnobotanist, and his job was to collect as much information as he could while the elders were still alive. And they had an amazing collection of plant species and what their uses were. It was in the hundreds. And so they hold that information dear. And that information's there. Frequently fired sites are important because they provide a barrier to fire flow. Fire is dependent on fuel. Weather, topography, and other things influence fire, but fire depends on fuel and ignition and heat. And places that we have that recently burned, they interrupt fire flow in the landscape. Our biggest problem right now is we don't have any of those, and fire is like a contagion. Everything is susceptible, so it can go the entire length and breadth of the landscape. But we have these recently burned sites, and that starts to hem it in and make it smaller. The importance of introducing large patches of deciduous is that they're barriers to fire spread. So mature stands of closed aspen retain understory moist conditions throughout the fire season. So when the adjacent conifer forests are starting to dry out and cure and the fuels are available, an adjacent aspen stand that's closed canopy will often still have very lush vegetation. So fire doesn't burn them very well. Unless you have really extreme drought conditions, aspen stands at the height of fire season are a barrier to fire spread. They are inflammable, and so they function as barriers to fire movement on the landscape. They're a great safety resource for fire crews because that's where we go when we're in trouble. We dive into aspen stands as safety zones. So they're a key source of diversity on the landscape, both structural and species. So it's very important to have healthy, mature stands of deciduous on the landscape. I am an extremely strong advocate of prescribed fire. I have been most of my career. It's one of the best tools in our toolbox. We are mimicking what indigenous people did as best we can. It's one of our most effective ways of reducing fuels and impacting future fire spread. If done well, it's a great tool. It's just fantastic, but it has to be done well and responsibly.